Thank you. We're just going to rearrange the furniture for a moment because we're going into my last session before we have a closing on the day and a perspective on what we've picked up today. It's called a Fireside Chat. I wish it was a bar stool chat, to be honest. It's getting close to aperitifs, isn't it? So maybe that's the time for it. Look, the title is Investment and International Trade Climate in the Context of Raw Materials Security and Global Supply Chains. I think we'd all agree it's been such a buffeting over the last few weeks and months in geopolitical terms. I don't know if it's extreme weather, you might call it, in terms of political climate. And we're going to focus on a little bit of that as well, the market uncertainty that comes with it, the trade challenges that are thrown into the mix. And we could do that with someone who really should know, because my guest for this session is now the head of global affairs for Appian Capital Advisory. He's been best known to me as my former Deputy Prime Minister, Foreign Secretary, Lord Chancellor, Justice Secretary, and Brexit Secretary. Ladies and gentlemen, Dominic Raab. Dominic, thank you very much indeed for this. Good to see you here. You've lost your tie as well. Look,
no.
All right, it is getting to that time of the evening. Let's start from that point if I can. It's been such an extraordinary few months politically, and everyone here talks about it all the time out there, some of the time in here. We're all buffeted around. There's massive uncertainty. Not a great time for markets, not a great time to invest. Have you found it all? What do you make of it all?
Well, I think it's worth putting it in some kind of context. So a lot of the short-term events have been catalysts for longer-term developments. So if you look at critical minerals, just to put it in some kind of context, we need to mine in the next 30 years something like the quantity we mined in the last 70,000 to hit our energy demands, to deal with the green transition. Also national security, the missile defense systems of the future, the F-16 fighters rely on rare earths. Against that, we have a market which is massively concentrated. Folk will remember in the 1970s the OPEC crisis, which was very much around a concentrated market, and the Yom Kippur War in 1974. You look at the four biggest oil and gas producers then, and they typically had somewhere between 11 and 26% of the market. Critical minerals, you're talking about a concentrated market where one supplier has 60, 70, 80 plus percent. Then you add on the US and China and tariffs, and frankly, you have all of the elements for a perfect geopolitical storm. But there are also ways to manage that from a European point of view, from a US point of view, a Western point of view, if you like. And what we need is cool heads to try and navigate.
Right, cool heads is one thing, but we've heard it time and again here. We need urgency too, and that's not perhaps Europe's strongest point always. So how do you square that circle?
This issue, both for businesses and for governments, reminds me of Eisenhower's paradox. And he said in around the 1950s, I've got urgent problems and I've got serious problems, but the serious problems aren't urgent and the urgent problems aren't serious. And although it's become urgent, China is ahead by 20 years. So we face a catch-up challenge. And we want to make it a race to the top with high ESG standards, not a race to the bottom.
But Dominic, sorry, it's more than just that, isn't it? It could be tomorrow that this becomes a further weaponization of China's assets. I mean, it is urgent. It could be that soon, and it is that serious.
Oh, if you're investing in the nickel market, you'd say that the problem is today, yesterday, because of the price manipulation that goes along with the other tools of a command economy, which everyone in this room knows is what's at stake. So I think the challenge is already upon us. And just to complete the picture, so investors talk about it, big mining companies and small mining companies understand it, but the OEMs, the car manufacturers, the other industrial base, if you like, not really involved in this debate. In fact, I'm always surprised when I come to conferences like this, how few there are engaged. We just did a CEO roundtable, which was excellent, with Bloomberg and EIT. But where are they? Because they're so focused on shareholder value, according to an annual financial reporting cycle, that they don't see something that 5 years down the track is going to fundamentally upend their business model. There are all sorts of ingredients, and I don't think there's a silver bullet to putting this right, but you need better public-private partnerships. You need to level the playing field with China in relation to CapEx, capital expenditure. Mining projects are incredibly expensive, but given the price volatility, that is magnified again. We need permitting reform in the US, in the EU, even in Canada, which I think is an excellent jurisdiction. I recently was in Quebec and Western Australia, so I think your panel before was spot on. And there's an interesting friendshoring piece, because whether it's the US or whether it's Europe, if you look at the volume and the range of critical minerals and rare earths, none of us will do it on our own. How do you put the end-to-end supply chain that provides the energy needs, the green transition that we're all talking about?
So where are the points that you think offer sort of glimmers of light and hope then? I mean, we've talked a little bit about the EU strategic projects that are being launched, which look at some of these issues, and they're pilots in a way to work out what might work better. That presumably is something that would interest investors.
Well, let me 3 points. Let me come on to that one third. First of all, in terms of CapEx, there's a lot of talk about a floor price now for ESG grade minerals. Now, I'm personally someone that comes from government. I'm not sure government's going to hand out the blank check for that. But we had an interesting...
You're probably sure they're not, actually.
That was code. You deciphered it very deftly, as you always do. But there is an interesting piece around long-term offtake agreements, strategic stockpiling, and perhaps a price range to give some stability for investors. I think permitting reform, that's something where politicians campaign in poetry and govern in prose. The EU has talked about that, particularly around the 47 projects. President Trump has talked about that. Well, we need to see that delivered in a way that doesn't cut across the social licensing which you need for mining, but which delivers more projects. And in terms of the EU's 47 strategic projects, look, I think it's great. That's exactly the conversation that needs to be had. Europe still suffers from the Henry Kissinger challenge of who do I call? And you've got 4 DGs that are interested. Whether it's DG Grow or DG Trade, it's difficult to know which one is properly leading. And I think the prescription is at least partway to solving the problem. But as always, the execution is a challenge. How much of this is Commission? How much of it is member states? If you're talking about permitting reform, which is part of the 47 strategic projects, is that done by member states? Again, how do you cut through that Gordian knot? And I think there's some question marks around the funding, but you want to use that funding, if it's coming from member states, governments or the EU, to unlock private sector capital. I think if we can complete the chain on those links, I think you've got a plan.
You mentioned President Trump there, and I mean, he's able to pump out executive orders, whether it's around permitting or, you know, the opportunity to reopen mines, processing, you name it, and it happens like that. Now, that's just not something that's really on offer over here. So how much longer need it take, and should we be envious of that American perspective?
Well, the US and on behalf of Appian Capital, I chair a group of equity investors that advise policymakers in the US. We did that in partnership with SAFE. But we know the interagency process there. It's tricky too. It's not a breeze in the US. And yes, the executive orders can take the US part of the way there, but some of these issues, particularly permitting, have almost identical challenges to the EU. So I don't think that's fundamentally... In fact, the US's record on permitting is worse than Europe's. It's the second slowest, according to S&P Global, in the world. Zambia is the only country slower with permitting. So there's no reason why the EU can't forge ahead. And one way you might do that around permitting is have a different process, directive that deals with this, whereby projects which are regarded as critical national infrastructure have a different time frame. So I think that's part of the piece. Another bit of positive learning, amidst all of the debate around tariffs, which is very polarizing, is some of those US institutions are now, for all the talk of onshoring, financing projects abroad with offtake and jobs creation into the US. The US Exim Bank, which deals with export-import. I wonder what the equivalent in the EU is. But if you're talking about friendshoring and unlocking private capital to deliver the strategic autonomy that I know the EU wants and is natural to want, That's an interesting piece, and that is something I think the Commission and the other institutions could work on.
Yeah, you think friendshoring you think is obviously very important, as are public-private partnerships. Having come from government, how it's an easy thing to say, isn't it, to talk about? How easy is it to bring to bear?
You need three things. You need a common vision. I think that the elements of that are there. We all agree, even in the US and I think the EU, there's quite a lot of bipartisan agreement that this is a strategic long-term challenge. You then need to put a plan together, and I think this is where the challenges start to creep in with public-private partnerships. You need the CapEx conundrum dealt with, permitting's part of it, and the friendshoring. But in the end, it's all about delivery. It's about, can you make that plan stick and can you get on with it? And I think not for any particularly unredeemable reasons, but because the division of labour within the EU, Commission, Parliament, Member States, and then locally within governments, I think that's a challenge. And the biggest, if you like, warning I would give from a government point of view, and I've been on that side of the fence, is be very careful about picking winners. You need an investor lens that will change, not just because of the long-term nature of these projects, but for example, there's a lot of research going into whether magnets for all of the national security hardware that's required actually really do need rare earths. Now, I'm not sure that they're going to crack that nut anytime soon, but the markets are very fluid, even for long-term investments, perhaps especially for long-term investments. So you need an investor lens, and that's where the public-private partnerships come in.
Why do you think that is still an issue in a way that governments, well, you said don't try and pick winners, but is it naivety? Is there an arrogance within government that we know what's best? What is it? As you say, you've been on both sides of the fence now.
Well, and the UK will be different from the EU, and different member states will be different. I mean, Germany's got a very good industrial base. The Nordics do very well. Norway, you think of, I know it's not an EU country, but in terms of smart investments. But in the end, commercial expertise is very hard to drag into government. And if you want an investor lens, it needs to be very fresh. So rather than trying to create that in-house capability, you need a public-private partnership. And you also need to lock in the OEMs, the car manufacturers, the downstream players, because in the end, they're the ones that need to be persuaded to pay this ESG premium or not to be a free rider and go running to, frankly, the cheapest source of low ESG grade minerals, which, given shareholder values, given pressures from investors, you can understand why that happens. So that's quite a complex jigsaw to put together. But that doesn't mean it's impossible, and I think there are some interesting contours here in the EU and comparative advantages that Europe has, but you've got to play to your strengths.
What would you say? We're here in the heart of the European Union, the capital of the EU, as it's very well known. Obviously, there are 27 member states looking at many of these issues which are in their own competence as well, and they can move quicker that way. What sort of block strikes you as a sensible block? Because you said, we're all in this together. No one country or organisation is going to resolve it itself, but some can move faster and be more flexible, more agile in smaller groups. Do you see, maybe from a British perspective, that there is an alliance that could be had, a block, a group that would actually work from a British perspective, from a small group perspective?
Yeah, it's interesting. And the EU likes strategic autonomy, but there is a premium in terms of operational delivery on clusters of high trust, well-aligned partners. And that may not be all 27. And indeed, as you said, it may make sense to go outside of the EU and deal with Norway, Switzerland, the UK, depending on what you're talking about. The critical thing is to understand where you sit in the value chain and how you make yourself indispensable to a supply chain. In the UK, it could be the finance side. Germany, it's the industrial base. And you look at the constellation where the natural resources actually sit. We talk about extraction and refining and processing. There's a really interesting piece around recycling now. Appian invests in US strategic metals in Missouri, and as well as producing copper, lithium, and various other critical minerals, it also recycles the lithium-ion batteries. Now, that's not just a good thing to do from a green point of view, it is actually helping suppress the supply-demand gap. I think that's an area where the EU could club together very smartly. But as with any public-private partnership or cluster of governments working together, you need a common vision and you need a clear division of labour, and then you need to get on and deliver. I think where the EU has fallen down in the past is probably on the delivery side for all sorts of understandable reasons. But as you said earlier, we don't have the luxury of time. We're already on catch-up. But again, I don't come with a counsel of despair. I think there are various comparative advantages, and we can learn from other jurisdictions. That's why I thought it was great having Western Australia and Quebec, two of the, if you like, state municipal levels in Canada and Australia respectively, both pioneers in mining, and both of those actually at state level doing great things. So we can learn from best practice around the world. But you've got a lot of good practice in the EU. It needs to be put together, though.
I mean, the the Critical Raw Materials Act throws out some very ambitious challenges, targets, goals, whatever word we might use, with regard to recycling, processing, mining as well. There's been a bit of, some would say, backpedaling with regard to the OEMs in the last few months. Have they overreached in those ambitious targets? Because 2030 is 5 years away.
Look, I would.
You're not a politician now.
I know. I'm just thinking that US expression. I'd rather a day late than a dollar short. So I would rather have a medium-term plan that was credible than try and rush something which is inevitably not going to deliver. The OEMs have got to be brought into this because they're the ones that will pay for it, and it will go to their margins. And so, funnily enough, I don't think that the EU is overreaching. I fear that the industrial base is underreaching. But we've got to close that gap. And it's the same everywhere. There's a gap between investor expectation and policymaker expectations. Look, if it were easy, it would have been done already. One of the things, though, you have is this Achilles heel for democracies which don't long-term plan the way China in a command economy has. So we need to try and resolve that in a way that combines the competitive spirit of so-called liberal democracies with their free market emphasis and the innovation that brings with the collaborative spirit that is going to be required. Actually, the EU is quite well placed to deal with that.
But how do we deal with, let's come back to the United States. We have a Trump administration, we have the drill baby drill attitude, we have a very clear picture on issues of diversity, on even to an extent ESG. There's suddenly a very different vibe globally about what's really important. And those all run pretty much counter to the perspective that we've had over here for the last few years. So, you know, we know America is a very big beast, and there's a man who is making that absolutely clear at the moment. So how do you hold on to your principles, in a sense, when it's such a competitive world out there?
Well, look, there's a protectionist wave, but that predates Donald Trump, and there are protectionist elements all across the world because when you're in government, the lobbying from those that might potentially lose out within a sector is always very vocal.
But it's also undermining the green transition message.
For sure. But there's also quite a lot of positive stuff going on in the critical mineral space in the US. And let's just park the tariffs. I'm a liberal free trade, always have been. You remember from our debates on Brexit. But aside from the question of tariffs, the executive orders on critical minerals, the emphasis on permitting reform, the expansion of EXIM's mandate, even the fact, and I think this is an interesting one for Europe, is taking this and saying, do you know what? We're going to set up a National Energy Dominance Council, which is going to make this a national security issue. And it does two things. One, it elevates it up beyond just pure normal trade, economic issues, even green issues, and it says that's going to be one of our top priorities. Secondly, with the challenge that I think the US interagency process has, as much as any other jurisdiction, it puts it firmly under the auspices of the White House, and that means you can, if you like, bring people together, coax and cajole them in a way that otherwise wouldn't happen. Now, whatever else, there's some interesting developments going forward. And you've got a president that whatever people think of the content is saying critical minerals matter, and I want people involved that are going to deliver on this. So I always look to distill out the best practice from around the world, within the EU, within the US, Canada, Australia. Tokyo is doing some very interesting things as well, and see what has resonance here, whether it's in the UK or in the European Union. And there's plenty.
He's also making the move towards ditching the Inflation Reduction Act. Is that a positive, actually, from this side of the world, or a negative?
So you've got this capital. Look, the critical minerals is not a level playing field, right? Because of the price manipulation. Whether tax breaks or grants or loans or subsidies are the right measure is a good question. We battle with that here, struggle with that here. The one thing I would say about the Inflation Reduction Act is 5 cents for every dollar that is spent on, for example, battery manufacturing goes into the upstream mining projects. So I just be careful about thinking it was the be-all and end-all. But there's going to be a fascinating debate about, if you're serious about catching up with China and promoting the kind of investments that they want, what's the substitute for that? And tariffs, certainly tariffs and tax breaks alone, I don't think will bridge that gap. But that's something they're grappling with very openly. I've been talked to folk across the US government, and I think they're very alive to it. But look, there's absolutely no doubt, whether it's Europe, Canada, Australia, UK, US, unless we deal with this CapEx problem, the capital expenditure problem, and the lack of a level playing field with China, we will not bridge the gap.
So, if I understand you correctly there, you felt that perhaps the Inflation Reduction Act it didn't reflect the whole value chain, and that's a sort of a missed opportunity. It's got to be, as well, the Chinese would say, when it's got to be the whole dragon.
Right. Look, I think you put it quite well there. But people get very addicted to subsidies. I think my reading of it would be that the number one legislative priority over the next year is going to be a tax bill. I think we've seen reading the tea leaves on that. Well, okay, but what happens? Is there an irreducible core of the Inflation Reduction Act, or at least some of those grants that will retain? Even projects that have already been selected, what's going to happen with that? Because investors watch that very carefully. And the one thing I think the new administration is very sensitive to is what business is saying, what is going to unlock commercial investment. We've seen that already in other areas. So I think they're very mindful of it. And the conversations I have in the US are actually very pragmatic and sensible. But things are moving forward. And what we need is a bit of momentum. And that's true in all these jurisdictions.
There are a lot of jurisdictions who are also driving momentum, and I mean, we've bumped into each other in a couple of other parts of the world. Saudi Arabia springs to mind. What have you picked up from some of those other places that they seem to have latched onto very effectively, that again, perhaps here in Europe we could learn from?
So look, if you look at the US or the EU, we will not provide the volume or the range of critical minerals alone. So you've got to friendshore. Typically, before recent events, we've sort of lent on our comfort zone, transatlantic partners, some of those traditional Pacific partners. And what I think is interesting, both as an accident of natural geography, but also where the investment is coming from, is can we pull in, for friendshoring purposes, the likes of Chile, Brazil, Argentina, even Peru. On the Asian side, Indonesia under a new president, Saudi Arabia for sure, even the Philippines, which is relatively low-hanging fruit. If you could get those 6 or 7, along with Europe, Canada, Australia, the UK, and the European jurisdictions, you start to have at least a cluster of like-minded partners that could bridge the volume and the range gap.
It's interesting, isn't it, how in a sense, the shoe's on the other foot in a way now. So some of the countries you've mentioned there, some of the providers of these materials are being courted left, right, and centre. I think the Chinese have just held a major conference out in Latin America. So whichever way we look, and when I say we, I mean Europe and the whole of Europe, and of course the UK is part of the whole of Europe. The challenges just grow. I mean, they get bigger. We're up against China now in whether it's Chile again, or they're already very well established there. So everywhere you look, it seems to me that the challenge is already there. And one or two people have said here, have we stopped to think about what happens if and when we don't actually get on that boat and save ourselves from sinking?
Oh, for sure. I think that's the right question to ask. But let's also not resort to accounts of total despair. The Belt and Road Initiative has receded to some degree, partly as a result of China's own internal pressures, but also the reaction from some of those non-aligned countries. When I was Foreign Secretary, I did a tour of East Africa, and it always stuck in my mind. I went to Sudan before the coup, Kenya and Ethiopia. I spoke to the heads of government in all those countries, and I said, but you would, if the US or the French or the Brits offered you an aqueduct or a road on these terms, that under Belt and Road terms, you would accuse us of neo-imperialism. They all said the same thing: make us a better offer. What does that better offer in the context of critical mineral supply chains look like? It ought to involve unlocking high ESG standards of private sector investment. It ought to involve, and it can involve, export finance. Can it also involve a more benign, even enlightened foreign policy wrapper, where you invest in the road, the rail, the port facilities, and some of the security and diplomatic assurances? There's a lot of talk about this now, but actually we've got comparative advantages right across the Western Hemisphere. But where I think I'm less encouraged is we do not play to our strengths. And if we're going to crack this nut, we're going to have to.
But doesn't that better offer, actually the evidence still suggests the better offer is probably a bigger share financially, otherwise you can go hang, because that's what we've seen in a number of countries relatively recently for Western mining companies.
Maybe. I think a really good conundrum is how far up the value chain the Western world, whether it's Europe, the UK, the US, needs to go to secure its supply chains. How much this is about jobs and how much is about supply chain security. So if you talk to Saudi Arabia or Brazil or any of those countries, Indonesia, they want to go up the value chain. They want to do the processing and the refining. Whereas, of course, and certainly I think in Europe, in the US, there's a big emphasis on trying to bring those jobs, onshore those jobs. But there's a pragmatic win-win to be done there, which could meet the needs on both sides. And I think if we are a bit more creative about it, we start to look more attractive to the so-called non-aligned jurisdictions.
Certainly not a counsel of despair. Actually, it's a counsel of some optimism that you've offered. If I can ask you this, give me what would be the one significant move that Europe could make to change the vibe, to change the momentum, to encourage everyone here, in fact, to think that no, it shouldn't be a counsel of despair
on critical mineral supply chains.
Yeah.
Look, I think I think it's that central impetus and drive. There isn't an equivalent to the National Energy Dominance Council. You still have the Henry Kissinger conundrum: who do I call? And if that can be reconciled, and that you get that sense of genuine leadership, not just regulatory prescription, in terms of driving these things forward, I think the other elements will fall into play, or certainly can.
Dominic, thank you very much indeed for that. Right, now, Brexit. No, we'll let that go for this evening. That's for a beer, I think.
Very good.
Thank you so much for
Pleasure.
sharing your thoughts. You've travelled widely, you've worked a lot with SAFE. I think you're looking at Europe's perspective as well in the same way, and perhaps a SAFE report to come. But we greatly value your time and your insights. Ladies and gentlemen, Dominic Raab.